The front door of Theo or Dani's luxurious Cape Town estate opened before anyone had a chance to knock. Theo stood there in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression calm and unreadable as 5 women stepped out of a waiting car. Each woman carried an expensive leather folder filled with qualifications, references, certificates, and years of professional childcare experience. Theo had specifically requested the best candidates available. He wanted someone educated, experienced, reliable, and capable of raising his 7-year-old daughter Zara in the environment he believed she deserved. He had even prepared a detailed list of requirements, leaving almost nothing to chance. Yet Theo had forgotten one thing. Zara had never cared much about what looked impressive on paper. "Zara, they're here," he called toward the staircase. A few seconds later, the quiet sound of little footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Zara appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a simple yellow dress, her dark hair tied neatly with ribbons. She was only 7, but there was something unusually observant about her. She looked at people carefully before deciding whether she trusted them. Theo had adopted her 14 months earlier after a long and complicated process, and since then, he had built his entire life around protecting her. "Come downstairs," he said. Zara slowly descended, one hand resting on the railing. When she entered the sitting room, the 5 candidates immediately straightened themselves. The first woman stepped forward with a bright smile. "Hello, Zara. My name is Christine. I've worked with children for almost a decade, and I speak several languages. I even brought some learning cards for you." Zara stared at her, but said nothing. The second woman introduced herself as Portia, and immediately mentioned that Theo had told her Zara loved drawing. She explained that she had studied child development and already had a creative learning program prepared for her. The third candidate proudly talked about the wealthy families she had worked for and how successful their children had become, the remaining to emphasize their certifications, connections, and professional experience. Theo watched quietly, convinced that one of these women would eventually win his daughter over. But Zara didn't seem impressed. She listened to every word without saying anything. Then she turned away from the 5 women. Her eyes moved toward the other side of the room, where Miriam stood quietly beside the window. Miriam wasn't wearing an expensive outfit. She wasn't carrying a leather folder. She wasn't there for an interview at all. She was wearing her simple grey household uniform, flat shoes, and a modest head covering. She had been working in Theo's house long before anyone had thought of hiring a new nanny. Miriam kept her eyes lowered, quietly folding a piece of linen as the candidate spoke. She had no idea that the most important decision of the morning was about to involve her. Zara walked across the room. Nobody understood what she was doing. Then she stopped in front of Miriam and wrapped both arms around her waist. The room became completely silent. Zara pressed her face against Miriam and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I choose her." Theo's expression changed immediately. "Zara," he said carefully, "Miriam works here. She isn't one of the nanny candidates." Zara didn't let go. "I know." Theo tried again. "The women here are trained professionals." Zara finally looked up at him. "I still choose Miriam." One of the candidates gave a small professional smile and explained that children often became attached to familiar household staff, but that attachment didn't necessarily mean the person was qualified to be a nanny. Another woman agreed, saying that once Zara had a professional caregiver, the situation would naturally change. Zara listened patiently. Then she looked at them with an expression far more serious than anyone expected from a 7-year-old. "Miriam stayed beside me when I was sick," she said. "She stayed all night when I had a fever and I was scared. Nobody told her to stay. She just stayed." The women became quiet. Zara continued, "None of you even knew me before today." Theo looked at his daughter. He could see that she wasn't throwing a tantrum. She wasn't being stubborn. She had already made a decision, based on something much deeper than qualifications. "You have until tomorrow morning," Theo told her. "But the decision will be one of these 5 women." Zara reached for Miriam's hand. "I've already decided." Theo dismissed the candidates and watched them leave with their carefully prepared portfolios. When the door finally closed, He looked toward Miriam. She lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "We'll talk later," Theo said before walking toward his study. Zara watched her father disappear, then turned to Miriam. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. Miriam smiled gently. "No, are you sure?" "I'm sure." Zara studied her face for a few seconds before taking her hand again. "Good," she said, "because it wouldn't be fair." Miriam smiled sadly. "Life isn't always fair." Zara looked at her with complete seriousness. "Then people should try harder to make it fair." That evening, the entire house felt different. The 5 candidates had left, but the tension remained. Miriam continued taking care of Zara, exactly as she always had. She prepared her bath, laid out her towel, helped her get ready for bed, and quietly made sure everything was exactly the way Zara liked it. These were things no certificate could teach. While sitting in the bath, Zara suddenly asked, "Will you leave if my father says no?" Miriam paused. "I work here. I'm not going anywhere." Zara shook her head. "That's not what I asked." Miriam looked at her carefully. "If he decides not to make me your nanny, I'll continue doing my regular work." Zara thought for a moment. Then she said, "Then I'll keep choosing you every day until he understands." Miriam didn't know what to say. She wanted to explain that adults didn't work that way, that powerful people made decisions and children had to live with them. But somehow, she knew Zara wouldn't accept that explanation. Later that night, Theo entered Zara's bedroom. He sat beside her and explained that the women he had interviewed were trained professionals who understood childhood development, education, and emotional care. Zara continued drawing. Then she asked one question that stopped him. "What did Miriam do when I had the fever?" Theo paused. "She stayed with you. She sang to me." Zara continued. "She stayed until morning. When I woke up, she was still there. She put her hand on my forehead and told me I was still warm and should go back to sleep." Theo remained silent. Zara finally looked up. "Which of those women would have done that?" "They would have called a doctor," Theo answered. "Miriam called the doctor too," Zara said. "She did both." Then she returned to her drawing. "I don't want someone who only knows what a book says about taking care of me. I want someone who actually takes care of me." "She knows me, Dad. They only know what you wrote about me." Theo stared at the drawing in her hands. There were 3 figures on the page, a tall one, a small one, and a medium-sized woman wearing a cloth around her head. "Think about it tonight," he told her. Zara looked directly into his eyes. "I already did." Theo turned off the light and left the room, but her words followed him into the hallway. For the first time, he began wondering whether he had been searching for the wrong thing all along. Later that night, Theo found Miriam alone in the kitchen, finishing the last of her cleaning. He watched her for a moment before asking her to sit down. Miriam immediately became nervous. She had spent more than a year working in the house and knew Theo as a strict, controlled man who rarely discussed personal matters with employees. "If I offered you the position of Zara's nanny," he said, "would you accept it?" Miriam looked genuinely surprised. She hesitated before answering. "Sir, I don't have the qualifications those women have. They have training, certificates, and years of experience with families like yours." Theo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "What did you do the night Zara was sick?" Miriam lowered her eyes. "I stayed with her." "Why?" "Because she was sick." Theo waited. Miriam finally looked up. "A child shouldn't be sick and frightened alone. It doesn't matter who employs you. If a child needs someone, someone should be there." Theo realized that Miriam had never considered that night extraordinary. To her, it had simply been the right thing to do. He asked one final question. "Were you working for this house that night, or were you working for Zara?" Miriam didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence told him everything. The next morning, the 5 candidates returned. They were even more prepared than before. Christine brought educational materials. Portia had created a complete daily schedule. Deborah had prepared a detailed philosophy of childcare. The other 2 arrived with impressive references from wealthy families. Zara came downstairs, holding her drawing book. Theo asked her to spend some time with each candidate and then make her final decision. I already have my answer, Zara said, but I'll listen because you asked me to. One by one, the women spoke about education, development, emotional intelligence, structured activities, and proper routines. Zara listened carefully. Then she began asking questions. If I woke up at 3 in the morning because I was scared, what would you do? Christine answered professionally that she would comfort her and help her calm down. Zara asked, would you stay until morning? Christine hesitated. Once she was settled, I would make sure you were okay. Zara quietly replied, Miriam stays until morning. She moved to the next woman. The same pattern continued. Each candidate gave a technically correct answer, but none of them gave Zara what she was actually looking for. She wasn't testing their knowledge. She was measuring whether they would stay when there was nothing to gain from staying. Finally, Zara looked at all 5 women and asked, which one of you would stay with me if you weren't being paid? The room became silent. One candidate immediately objected, saying that this was a professional position and that the question wasn't fair. Zara nodded. That's my point. Then she looked at Theo. I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm saying Miriam already loves me, and love isn't something you can hire. Theo felt those words hit him harder than he expected. He dismissed the candidates and went upstairs to find Miriam. She was changing the linen in a guest room when he approached her. Leave that for now, he said. Miriam turned toward him. I've sent the candidates away, Theo continued. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Miriam nodded. Do you love my daughter? There was no hesitation. Yes, sir. Theo swallowed. Does she know? Yes. How? Miriam answered simply. Because I show up. She explained that she had been there even when she wasn't scheduled, even when it was 3 in the morning, even when she was exhausted. Not because she lives in this house, Miriam said. Because she's Zara, and Zara matters. Theo stared at her for a long moment. Then he apologized. He admitted that Miriam had already been doing the real work of caring for his daughter for 14 months without receiving the title, salary, or recognition that came with it. He had spent time searching for someone to do what she had already been doing every day. That was wrong, he said. The position is yours. Miriam's eyes filled with emotion. Theo offered her a proper salary, a formal title, and full authority over Zara's care. Miriam accepted quietly. Before leaving, Theo asked about the song she had sung to Zara during the fever. Miriam explained that it was an old song her own mother had once sung to her. Theo nodded. She remembered every word. He thanked Miriam for staying. Then he went downstairs to tell the 5 candidates that their services were no longer needed. When Miriam found Zara in the garden and told her that Theo had offered her the job, Zara immediately ran into her arms. This time, Miriam hugged her back without worrying about professional boundaries. Zara reminded her, I told you I'd keep choosing you. Miriam laughed through her tears. That evening, something happened that had never happened before. Theo asked Miriam to sit at the dinner table with him and Zara. It was a small gesture, but inside that enormous house, it felt like a major change. 4 years, everyone had known exactly where they belonged. Theo was the owner. Miriam was an employee. Zara was the child. But now the 3 of them sat together. Zara placed a drawing on the table. It showed 3 figures standing together. I drew this before Dad made his decision, she explained. Theo looked at it carefully. Does it have a title? He asked. Zara thought for a moment. Family. The words stayed in the room. Miriam looked at Theo, and for perhaps the first time, she saw something different in his expression. Not pity, not charity, but recognition. He finally understood that the house had never truly needed another nanny. It had needed him to recognize the person who was already part of his daughter's heart. Weeks passed, and the new arrangement slowly became normal. Miriam handled Zara's mornings, meals, schoolwork, reading, and bedtime. She did exactly what she had always done. But now she no longer had to do it quietly from the background. She was finally allowed to be what Zara had always believed she was, Zara began changing too. She became happier, calmer, and more confident. She slept better. She began writing little stories in her drawing book and reading them aloud. One afternoon, Theo returned home early and saw Zara sitting on the floor beside Miriam, reading a book. Zara struggled over a difficult word. Miriam quietly helped her pronounce it, then let her continue. Theo stood in the doorway watching them. The scene unexpectedly reminded him of his own childhood. When he was young, there had been a woman named Clara who worked in his parents' home. Theo had loved her deeply. She had cared for him 4 years. But one day she simply disappeared. His parents had told him she had gone to work for another family. As a child, he had accepted the explanation because he had no choice. Now, watching Zara with Miriam, he understood something he hadn't understood back then. Children don't see employees and employers. They see the people who feed them, comfort them, listen to them, and stay beside them when they're afraid. Theo realized that his own childhood had taught him to believe caregivers were temporary. He had unknowingly carried that lesson into Zara's life. He refused to repeat it. He went into his study and contacted his lawyer. He wanted Miriam's employment formalized properly, with long-term protections and a secure position. He didn't want Zara growing up believing that the people she loved could disappear simply because someone higher in the social order decided they were no longer needed. A week later, one of Theo's wealthy associates heard about Miriam's promotion. During a business lunch, he asked, "I heard you made your housekeeper your daughter's nanny. Isn't that unusual?" Theo simply answered, "My daughter made the case." The man smiled as though the decision were a charming little story. But Theo wasn't joking, and she was right. Later that week, Zara was getting ready for bed when she suddenly asked Miriam, "Are you scared that someone will take me away from you?" Miriam stopped. Zara explained that she knew what it felt like to be taken away, because she herself had once been separated from everything she knew. Miriam thought about her own mother, a woman who had spent her life cleaning other people's homes while raising her daughter with dignity. Her mother had always told her, "Go where you're needed. Give what you have. Don't wait to be thanked." Miriam had carried those words into Theo's home. She had never expected anyone to notice. She had never expected Zara to understand. But the little girl had noticed every single thing. Months and years later, Zara would barely remember the 5 women who had arrived with their expensive portfolios. She wouldn't remember their certificates or carefully prepared answers. She wouldn't remember exactly what each woman had said during the interview. But she would remember Miriam. She would remember the smell of Miriam's clothes after laundry day. She would remember the old song Miriam sang when she was sick. She would remember sitting in the kitchen eating mango and talking about ordinary things. Most importantly, she would remember the feeling of knowing that someone would be there when she needed them. Theo also changed. He became less concerned with appearances and more aware of the people around him. He understood that wealth could purchase comfort, education, security, and opportunity, but it couldn't purchase genuine love that had to be earned through countless small actions. One evening, Theo watched Miriam helping Zara with her homework. Zara suddenly looked up and said, "Miriam, I think you're the best nanny in the world." Miriam smiled. "I'm the only nanny you've ever had." Zara shook her head. "Exactly." Theo laughed quietly from the doorway. He had learned something from his daughter that no business deal had ever taught him. Sometimes children recognize truth faster than adults because they haven't yet learned to judge people by status. They don't care about expensive clothes, prestigious references, or impressive certificates. They care about who sits beside them when they're afraid. They care about who remembers how they like their blanket folded. They care about who notices when their smile isn't real. They care about who stays. And Miriam had stayed. She had stayed when Zara was sick. She had stayed when Zara was frightened. She had stayed when nobody was watching. She had never demanded recognition for it. She simply cared. That was why Zara had chosen her before Theo ever understood why. One afternoon, Theo found Zara drawing again. He looked over her shoulder. 3 figures stood together on the page. Another family picture. He asked, Zara nodded. This one is different. Theo studied it. How? Zara pointed at the 3 figures. Because now everyone knows we're family. Theo looked at Miriam, who was standing nearby. She smiled softly. Theo understood the meaning immediately. Family wasn't always created by blood. Sometimes it was created by presence. Sometimes it was created by a person showing up over and over until a child realizes they are safe. That night, Theo sat with Zara and Miriam at the same table. There were no interviews, no portfolios, no questions about qualifications. There was only dinner, laughter, and a child who finally felt completely secure. Theo looked at the 2 people beside him and realized that the greatest change in his life hadn't come from a business deal or an investment. It had come from a 7-year-old girl refusing to let an ordinary act of kindness be overlooked. Zara had chosen Miriam because she had seen something the adults couldn't see. She had seen love in its simplest form. Not promises, not credentials, not words, just someone who stayed. Years later, Zara would understand exactly why that day mattered. She would remember the moment she walked across the room, ignored 5 highly qualified candidates, and wrapped her arms around the woman who had already earned her trust. She would remember the silence that followed when she said, "I choose her." But most of all, she would remember what Miriam had taught her without ever giving her a formal lesson. The people who truly love you are not always the people with the most impressive titles. Sometimes they're the people standing quietly in the background, doing things nobody notices. They're the ones who bring you water when you're sick, sit beside your bed at 3 in the morning, listen when you have nothing important to say, and stay even when nobody is watching. Theo once believed he needed to find the perfect nanny for his daughter. In the end, his daughter showed him that the perfect caregiver had been inside his home all along. Miriam didn't win the position because she had the best resume. She didn't have the highest qualifications or the most impressive references. She won because Zara already knew something the adults had forgotten. Love cannot be measured on paper. A certificate can prove what someone has studied. A reference can tell you what someone has done. But only time reveals who someone truly is. Miriam had proven herself through 14 months of ordinary moments. And those ordinary moments had become extraordinary to a little girl who desperately needed someone she could trust. That night, Zara placed her final drawing on the dining table. It showed 3 people holding hands. Underneath, written in uneven children's handwriting, were just 2 words, "Our family." Theo stared at those words for a long moment. Then he looked at Miriam. She smiled. Zara reached across the table and held both of their hands. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The little girl who had once been afraid that the people she loved could disappear finally knew she was safe. And the billionaire father, who thought money could solve every problem, finally learned the one lesson money could never buy. Sometimes the greatest thing if a child isn't a perfect life, it's someone who never stops showing up. So if this story touched your heart, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments, would you have made the same choice as Zara?